Glass is not something man created. It first appeared in nature. Humanity discovered it only later. So, the question is not how glass was invented, but rather, how did humans first encounter it? For thousands of years, people lived with stone. They hunted with stone, cut with stone, and defended themselves with stone. Stone was everywhere, and it was the same for everyone, until, in certain places, some stones began to behave differently. When they broke, they didn't crumble. They left behind smooth, sleek surfaces. They were razor-sharp. These stones weren't found everywhere, but wherever they were noticed instantly. Back then, people only knew that it was different. This stone, which we call obsidian today, was actually natural glass, and it was one of humanity's first encounters with glass. The difference in this stone became clearer as it was used. It didn't shatter randomly. It could be controlled. It didn't dull like other stones. It created much sharper edges. Before metal existed, this quality was a massive advantage. That is why people began to specifically select, keep, and carry obsidian with them. It was no longer a coincidence. It was a conscious choice. As its utility was realized, people began to pursue it. The fact that it wasn't found everywhere made it even more precious. Obsidian didn't just stay where it was used. It was carried, traded, and reached distant lands. This showed that humans now recognized this stone and were specifically searching for it. But there was an interesting limit. Obsidian was only found in specific regions. It was impossible to come across this stone in places without volcanoes. In other words, humans could use it, but they couldn't control it. They didn't know when they would find it, or how much they could obtain. This situation gave birth to a new thought in the human mind. This substance formed on its own in nature. It was hard. It was shiny. It could be sharpened. If nature could do this, perhaps humans could do something similar. This wasn't knowledge yet. It wasn't a method. It was just a slowly forming idea. At one point, people realized this. No matter how useful a substance was, if it couldn't be controlled, it remained limited. Obsidian could be found, but it couldn't be produced. This made it as inadequate as it was indispensable. At this very point, the relationship between humans and their environment began to change. Fire was already a part of life. It was used for cooking, for warmth, and for protection. But now, fire was being thought of not just as a necessity but as a tool. Man saw that fire changed everything it touched. Hardened surfaces, melting stones, substances changing shape. And without even realizing it, man had begun to produce glass. And the thought emerged. If a glass-like substance appeared in nature through high heat, perhaps man could achieve something similar by using fire. This wasn't a moment of discovery. It wasn't a formula found overnight. It was simply repeated trials. Mistakes, failures, useless results. But the important thing was this. Man had reached a point where he was no longer just a finder of glass, but someone trying to understand it. Fire wasn't always lit at random. There were fires that were kept in the same place for a long time, for days, sometimes weeks. When people returned to where these fires had gone out, they began to notice that the ground was no longer the same. The earth was harder. In places, it had become shiny. Sometimes right under the fire, sometimes just around it, surfaces appeared that looked like stone, but were unlike stone. Pieces that behaved differently when broken, reflecting light in a different way. This wasn't a stone taken from inside a mountain. This time, the matter had changed right where the fire had burned. Man didn't yet know what he was facing, but he realized it was different from obsidian. Not every place where fire burned for a long time gave the same result. But on certain grounds, the traces left after the fire went out were repeated. People began to notice this. In the same type of soil, after the same type of fire, similar surfaces were forming. Areas that were hardened, smoothed, and shiny in places. These surfaces didn't appear everywhere. Not on a mountaintop, not in the forest, not in the mud. They usually appeared on riverbanks, on shores, in open fields. Man didn't yet know why, but he noticed this. These soils were fine. They were granular. They took the heat in and then gave it back as a different surface. This was the second big clue from nature in the story of glass. Man still didn't know he was making glass, but he had sensed a relationship between fire and a specific type of ground. And this intuition was about to go one step beyond coincidence. These grounds had a common feature. People hadn't named it yet, but this earth was different from others. It was fine. It could be crumbled. It flowed under the feet. This ground we call sand today was just an ordinary part of the landscape then. But when it came into contact with fire, it lost its ordinariness. Because the secret of glass was actually inside the sand. This fine earth left under the fire didn't seem to melt, but it hardened. When it cooled, it didn't break like stone. It behaved differently. People weren't doing this consciously. They lit fires in the same place and saw the same traces over and over. And each time, the surface left behind felt a bit more familiar. This was no longer entirely a coincidence, but it wasn't knowledge yet either. For the first time, man had begun to notice that glass might not be something found only in nature. It could reappear when the right conditions came together. There was fire. There was ground. There was time. The only thing missing was realizing that this was not an accident. And right here, human behavior began to change. Fire was no longer just lit and left. It was lit repeatedly in the same place, on the same ground, under similar conditions. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes the ground crumbled. But sometimes, when the fire went out, the remaining surface resembled what they had seen before. Not every time, not for everyone, but for those who paid enough attention. What appeared wasn't large. It wasn't smooth. It certainly wasn't durable. But it was different. It didn't swallow light like stone. It shone. Man still didn't know what he held in his hands, but he understood now that it wasn't obsidian. This time, it didn't come from the mountain. It came from the edge of the fire man had lit. That's why no one gave it a name. No one defined it. No one said, "We made glass." But one thing was clear. This substance was no longer just something found. Sometimes, when the same conditions were met, it would reappear. This wasn't mastery yet, but it was a threshold. For the first time, man realized that he could recreate something he had seen in nature with his own fire. The resulting glass pieces weren't yet reliable tools. They weren't durable. They couldn't be made larger, and they didn't yield the same result in every attempt. Therefore, people didn't use glass to cut, drill, or build. Instead, they accepted it as it was, in its small form. Glass pieces were kept, carried, and often worn. Perforated beads, small ornaments, and jewelry emerged. This use was the result of awareness rather than necessity. Glass was valuable not because it was useful, but because it was extraordinary. Because it wasn't found everywhere, it was given a special meaning. Over time, glass began to be placed not only with the living, but also with the dead. Finding glass beads in burial sites shows that this substance carried a symbolic value in early periods. Humans couldn't yet produce glass, but they knew it was different from other stones. This acceptance formed the foundation for the next stage in the history of glass, the path to conscious production. This early period showed that glass was not invented. It was first noticed in nature. It was given meaning. And slowly, it began to be understood. But this was just the beginning of the story. The real transformation would start at the exact moment man tried to overcome this very uncertainty.